If you look at Israel only through a phone screen, the country seems like a set of ready-made answers. Desert, Jerusalem, army, startups, religion, war. Every word is recognizable. Every one provokes a strong reaction. And that is precisely why almost everyone gets in the way of seeing reality. The ready-made image saves time. We no longer need to understand how water works, why the week starts on Sunday, what is hidden beneath the streets of Acre, and why one city can simultaneously be a home, a holy site, and an international dispute. But the convenient picture is almost always assembled from half the truth. Today, we will examine 30 myths about Israel, not from the harmless to the sensational, and not from 30th place to first. We will take a different route. From an ordinary morning, food, language, and calendar, to the structure of society, then to the desert and water, then descend underground into archaeological layers, and end in Jerusalem, where all simple explanations stop working. Each myth will have the same check: what people usually say, what grain of truth helped this claim survive, what the documents show, and what important piece ended up outside the frame. Let's agree on boundaries right away. This is not an attempt to pass judgment on the country, nor a tourist advertisement. We will not explain entire peoples by a single character, present religious tradition as the opinion of every believer, or turn an ancient stone into proof of a modern political right. Where data changes, I will name the year. Where a dispute exists, we will leave the dispute open. And where a source can only confirm part of the story, we will not make it say more. Before starting the list, it is important to understand why myths around Israel are produced at such speed. The first reason is the density of events. Here, an ancient archaeological layer can lie under a modern road. A religious holiday changes the transport schedule, and a water project simultaneously becomes an environmental, economic, and foreign policy issue. When there are too many reasons, mass culture picks one. Thus, a convenient version appears. The desert was conquered by technology. The state was created by one declaration. Society was united by the army. And one ancient object explained the modern conflict. The second reason is the distance between personal experience and a global symbol. A person lives in an apartment, takes a child to school, buys groceries, and argues with the utility service. But the outside observer sees them as a representative of a religion, a state, or a conflict. Ordinary life disappears under a big sign. The stronger the symbol, the harder it is to see the person. Jerusalem in the news is holy sites, negotiations, and clashes. Jerusalem for a resident is also a bus, a neighbor, a pharmacy, the rent price, and the route to work. The third reason is the habit of confusing explanation with justification. If you try to explain why a society pays so much attention to security, the listener may decide you are justifying any state action. If you mention the suffering of Palestinians, another listener will hear a denial of Israeli fear. But explaining a mechanism does not have to issue a moral indulgence. One can simultaneously acknowledge the reality of the threat, examine the proportionality of the response, see the human consequences, and not reduce millions of people to the decision of a government or an armed group. The fourth reason is the language of absolutes. All, never, only, completely, forever. These words make a headline strong and almost always worsen accuracy. If you say Israel is almost independent of rain, you need to specify in which category of water supply, in which year, and thanks to what infrastructure. If you call Hebrew the only revived language, you need to define what counts as revival and mass everyday use. If you declare a city the most ancient, you will have to decide whether we are comparing the date of the first traces, continuity of habitation, or the existence of urban structure. The fifth reason is repetition. A viewer hears a number in a video, then encounters it in an article, and again in a short video. 3 encounters create the feeling of 3 confirmations, though all may have copied one old text. Especially quickly, prices, population, water levels, terms of service, tax rates, and tourist rules become outdated. So we will be careful with numbers from travel notes. They convey the experience of a specific moment well, but work poorly as an eternal fact. The 6th reason is the temptation of national character.
If technology is successful, it is explained by the people's special boldness. If a conversation is loud, by national directness. If politics is conflictual, by an eternal tendency to argue. Such explanations seem profound because they use culture, but often simply hide institutions. A startup does not arise from character in a vacuum, but from money, education, the global market, migration, a research environment, and a network of trust. Loud speech may depend on a social norm, but a specific person remains a specific person. Finally, myths are convenient for societies themselves. They provide a shared history to be proud of, explain difficulties, and transform chance into destiny. Masada becomes a story about a people that never surrenders. Desert agriculture becomes proof of victory over geography. The revival of Hebrew becomes a symbol of national return. These stories carry genuine meaning.
The problem arises not when a society creates a symbol, but when the symbol forbids questioning. Therefore, our route will not be a competition in debunking. We will not demean tradition by finding an inaccuracy in a popular formulation. We will attempt to do something more difficult, to preserve human meaning while simultaneously restoring boundaries to the facts. A myth can be historically inaccurate and culturally important. An engineering achievement can be real and carry an ecological cost. A document can proclaim a principle without guaranteeing its full implementation. Such duality is not a weakness of the story, but its honesty. According to the Central Bureau of Statistics of Israel, by the end of 2024, the country's population exceeded 10 million people, taking into account the updated methodology and the foreign population. Within this figure are Jews of various traditions and origins, Muslim Arabs, Christian Arabs, Druze, people without religious classification, foreign workers, and many families that cannot be described by a single checkbox. Therefore, the first myth of this film goes like this. Myth number 1. An Israeli is one recognizable type of person. In mainstream cinema, he usually speaks fast, argues loudly, served in the army, works at a tech company, and talks about politics, food, and security with equal confidence. Some traits indeed grew out of the local environment. Short distances between people, strong family networks, mandatory service for a significant portion of the population, constant public debate. But a stereotype is not the population. The Central Bureau of Statistics publishes not only the total number of residents, but also the distribution by groups, religion, age, and migration background. These data show a country assembled from different demographic histories. One person grew up in a family that spoke Arabic for many generations. Another's parents came from the former Soviet Union. A third belongs to an ultra-Orthodox community. A fourth defines themselves as secular. A fifth came for work and is not a citizen. Even the word Jew does not automatically tell you what language a person grew up speaking, how religious they are, or how they vote. The stereotype has another trap. It turns a visible minority into a silent backdrop. According to Israeli statistics for 2025, Arabs made up about a fifth of the population. This is not a minor exception that can be mentioned in a single line. These are millions of people with different cities, professions, religious affiliations, and political positions. The Christian part of the population is also not homogeneous. In the statistical review for Christmas 2025, most Christians in Israel were Arabs, but non-Arab Christian communities also existed. Therefore, an honest answer to the question, "What are Israelis like?" begins not with an adjective, but with a counter-question. Which city, generation, language, and community are we talking about? The myth collapses not because a general character does not exist at all. It collapses because a general character cannot replace a biography. Myth number 2. In Israel, everyone speaks only Hebrew. Hebrew indeed dominates the state system, education, most national media, and everyday urban speech. But just walk through a market, enter a hospital, or ride a bus to hear Arabic, Russian, English, Amharic, French, Yiddish, and other languages. A common language connects society, but does not erase family languages. Arabic is particularly interesting. Before the adoption of the Basic Law on the Nation-State in 2018, it had the status of an official language alongside Hebrew. Afterwards, the law granted it a special status and stipulated the preservation of its previous practical use.
This is a legal formula, but behind it lies a real, everyday question. In what language does a person receive information from the state, read a road sign, study, and seek medical care? Russian became prominent after the large waves of immigration from the Soviet Union and post-Soviet countries. It can be heard in stores, seen in announcements, and encountered in media. For an elderly person, the language can determine whether they can independently understand a doctor's prescription or a bank letter. For their grandchild, Russian may remain the language of conversation with family, while studies and work are conducted in Hebrew. Therefore, the myth, "everyone speaks Hebrew," is wrong twice over. It overlooks multilingualism, and it also creates the impression that language is a switch. Yesterday, a person spoke one language. Today, they started speaking another. In reality, language layers. One is needed at home, another in an institution, a third for work with an international company. And it is precisely this multi-layeredness that leads us to the next myth. Myth number 3. Hebrew was a dead language, and one man simply revived it. This is one of the most beautiful stories about modern Israel, and it has a real foundation. For many centuries, Hebrew was preserved as the language of sacred texts, prayer, study, and written culture. But it was not the everyday spoken language of most Jewish communities. Eliezer ben Yehuda became a prominent organizer of the movement for spoken Hebrew, worked on a dictionary, created and promoted new vocabulary, insisted on using the language at home. But turning a huge social process into the biography of one hero means, once again, choosing a convenient myth. For a language to become everyday, it is not enough to invent words. You need teachers, schools, newspapers, publishers, families, and children who stop translating every thought in their heads. You need words for train, electricity, microbe, insurance contract, and a child's quarrel. You need a shared environment where people with different native languages choose a new language because otherwise they cannot talk to each other. And this process was not painless. When a new common language gains strength, family languages can recede. A child begins to answer parents in Hebrew, even if they understand their Russian, Arabic, or Amharic. Along with the language, access to family memories and literature sometimes weakens. The success of Hebrew is real, but the cost of linguistic unification is also real. It is more accurate to say this: Hebrew was not raised from the grave by a single decision. It was gradually moved from the space of text into the space of the kitchen, school, street, and market. The language came alive not at the moment a dictionary was published, but then, when people began using it to ask a child to pick up toys and to argue over a late bus. Myth number 4.
Israeli cuisine belongs only to Israel. On the table lies a plate of hummus, next to it falafel, salad, tahini, pickles, and bread. A tourist sees a set of national symbols. But food in the Middle East rarely respects modern borders. Hummus is eaten and claimed as their own in different countries and communities of the region. Falafel is linked to several culinary traditions. Shakshuka came from North Africa along with migrants. Even the familiar Israeli salad cannot be understood without the broader history of the Eastern Mediterranean. Arguments about the origin of food seem funny until you notice that behind them lies a struggle for visibility. If a dish is declared an exclusively new national invention, Arab, Palestinian, North African, and other cuisines from which local food was assembled can disappear from the frame. But the opposite claim, that Israeli cuisine does not exist at all because every dish has a backstory, is also too simplistic. A cuisine is born not only at the moment of the first recipe. It changes in new cities, adapts to products, work schedules, religious norms, and the tastes of new generations. A hummus place that opens in the morning and closes when the daily batch runs out is already a social ritual. Falafel in pita is not just a recipe, but a cheap urban lunch whose price can tell you about the cost of living. Shakshuka in a cafe differs from the one a family makes at home, but both versions become part of the local language of food. The right angle here is not who stole the dish, but how the dish traveled. Instead of a patent, we see a route. Trade, migration, neighborliness, war, memory, and adaptation. Food does not prove the purity of a culture. It proves that cultures are almost never pure. Myth number 5. Hummus is just a cold appetizer. For someone used to buying a small box at the supermarket, hummus is a paste next to the sauces.
But in local culture, fresh hummus can be a main dish. It is served warm or at room temperature, topped with whole chickpeas, tahini, olive oil, spices, sometimes meat or mushrooms. It is eaten with bread, not necessarily with a spoon. And most importantly, people argue about texture as seriously as in another country they argue about the doneness of a steak. Why does this myth deserve a separate point? Because it shows how an industrial product changes our understanding of the original. Store-bought hummus must withstand transportation and storage. Restaurant hummus is made for immediate serving. These are different tasks, and therefore different acidity, density, and taste. The name remains the same, but the experience changes completely. There is also a political layer. In the region, competitions were held for the largest plate of hummus, turning food into a symbol of national prestige. From the outside, it looks like a funny battle of records. Inside, it is a familiar desire to declare, this culture is visible, it belongs to us. But a giant plate does not solve the question of origin. It only shows how strongly food can become a flag. Therefore, the best test of a myth occurs not in the record book, but at an ordinary table. Ask the cook from whom he learned to cook, why he uses exactly this chickpea, and how long he boils it. And the national symbol will become a human story again. Myth number 6. Falafel is just a cheap snack, the same everywhere. Falafel indeed serves as fast food. Balls of ground legumes with spices are fried and placed in pita with salads, pickles, tahini, and hot sauce. But the word same disappears after the first comparison. The base changes, the blend of herbs, the degree of grinding, the size of the ball, the oil temperature, and the set of add-ons. Even the order in which the vendor fills the pita affects whether the bottom part stays dry or falls apart within a minute. Even more important is the economics. The price of falafel is almost a household index. It is noticed by students, school children, workers, and tourists. When chickpeas, oil, vegetables, rent, and electricity become more expensive, it is reflected in the small paper receipt. High indicators in the technology sector may seem distant, but the rise in price of a familiar meal is felt immediately. This is why street food is often more honest than an advertising report on well-being. It shows how much basic comfort a person can buy on an average salary and how much time they are willing to spend on food in the middle of a workday. Falafel does not explain the entire economy, but it brings back to the economy its smell, its cue, and its concrete price. Myth number 7. The Israeli breakfast is an ancient tradition that has always looked the same. The modern hotel breakfast, with eggs, cheeses, salads, fish, bread, olives, and spreads, seems eternal. In reality, its format is linked to the life of early agricultural communes. People started work very early, returned after the first hours of labor, and needed a substantial meal. Later, this practical set turned into a hotel brand. Shakshuka also shows how cultural memory works. Its name and North African history recall migrations from Tunisia, Libya, and other countries in the region. In the new society, the dish became common, but this does not mean its past disappeared. On the contrary, each such recipe preserves a map of migrations better than many official posters. The myth of the ancient national breakfast arises because tourism loves continuity. It is pleasant for a guest to think that today's plate has come unchanged from biblical times. Reality is more interesting. Part of the products are ancient, part of the serving methods are younger than the state, and the overall format grew out of labor, the hotel industry, and the blending of cuisines. A tradition does not have to be 1,000 years old to become real. Myth number 8. Kashrut is a list of products considered unclean. Such an explanation is convenient because it translates a complex religious legal system into the language of modern sanitation. But kashrut is not a rating of cleanliness. It is a system of fitness of food according to religious prescriptions. It defines permitted types of animals, methods of preparation and slaughter, separation of meat and dairy, checking of ingredients and utensils.
Pork is forbidden not because a modern laboratory has deemed it dirtier than beef, but because the animal does not meet the religious signs of a permitted species. From this arise decisions that the tourist perceives as culinary oddities. A kosher meat establishment will not serve regular milk cheese with a burger. A hotel may have separate zones, utensils, and equipment. The certification concerns not only the final dish, but also its production chain, and the degree of observance varies. For one person, basic certification is sufficient. Another accepts only specific supervision. A third does not observe these rules at all. It is precisely this last detail that destroys the second layer of the myth, that the entire country eats the same way. Israeli society includes secular, traditional, religious, and ultra-Orthodox people. The Central Bureau of Statistics, in a 2025 survey, showed a wide spectrum of self-identification among adult Jews, from secular to ultra-Orthodox. Therefore, the presence of kashrut in the public space does not prove the identical practice of every resident. It shows how a religious norm becomes part of the economy, politics, and everyday compromises. Let us see how this compromise works on a product almost made for paradox. Under strict, widespread interpretations of kashrut, sturgeon is not considered a permitted fish. At the same time, there are farms in the country that raise sturgeon and produce caviar primarily for export. At first glance, this is absurd. Why produce an expensive product that a significant part of the religious market does not deem fit? The answer is economic. State borders, religious norms, and the market do not have to coincide. A company can grow what is bought abroad, even if the product is almost absent from the domestic kosher table. Similarly, winemaking cannot be explained by a single line from an ancient vineyard to a modern bottle. Archaeologists find ancient wine presses and traces of production in the region, but the tradition experienced breaks. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the industry was essentially rebuilt, and modern quality is linked to agronomy, international varieties, local soils, and cellar technology. The phrase, wine for 7,000 years, sounds beautiful on a label, but no single winery today has been operating continuously for 7,000 years. The antiquity of a region and the age of a business are different quantities. There is a drink that shows cultural blending even better: arak, a clear anise distillate, common throughout the eastern Mediterranean. If you add water, it turns milky white. The essential oils stop being fully dissolved in the diluted alcohol and form a suspension. This is the physics of an emulsion, not a secret of any one nation. But at the table, the physical effect becomes a ritual. Water, ice, small dishes, long conversation. Science explains the color. Culture explains the meaning. Even an orange can hold political and trade history. The variety known worldwide as Jaffa is linked to the port of Jaffa and citrus exports. But a global brand outlives changes in borders, owners, and production. When the name of a city ends up on a box of fruit, it begins to live separately from any specific orchard. We see the same mechanism again. Culture likes to say ours, and trade likes to say recognizable. Between them, there always remains the story of the people who grew, packed, and transported the goods. Therefore, cuisine is not a light pause between serious topics. It shows how the national is built from the regional, how a religious norm meets export, how ancient origins turn into modern marketing, and how the price of a street meal speaks about the economy better than an abstract ranking. If you remove foreign influences, migrations, and trade from food, what remains on the plate is not pure tradition, but emptiness. And now we move from food to time.
Because the rules of the kitchen can be bypassed by choosing a restaurant, but the calendar meets a person regardless of his beliefs. Myth number 9. In Israel, weekends are arranged the same as in Europe: Saturday and Sunday. The first workday of the week here is Sunday. The main work rhythm runs until Thursday. Friday is often a short day, and Saturday is linked to Shabbat. For someone who works with Europe, this creates a small time gap. A European email arrives on Friday when the local office is already slowing down, and a reply on Sunday reaches the recipient on his day off. Shabbat does not begin by the clock hand at the same moment year-round, but before sunset on Friday and ends after nightfall on Saturday. In religious tradition, it is not just physical labor that is prohibited, but certain types of creative activity. Modern technology required new interpretations. What does it mean to turn on electricity, press an elevator button, open a refrigerator if a sensor activates? Thus appeared household solutions that seem like an engineering puzzle to a visitor. A Shabbat elevator stops at floors automatically so that the passenger does not need to press a button. A timer turns on lights in advance. Some appliances receive a special mode that disables ordinary reactions to human action. Technology here does not abolish the ancient rule, but enters into negotiations with it. But the myth is not only about wrong weekends. It creates the impression that the entire country stops in the same way. Jerusalem, a religious district, a secular quarter of Tel Aviv, and an Arab city live Saturday differently. Somewhere, public transport almost disappears. Somewhere, cafes and commercial routes operate. And somewhere, the weekly religious rhythm is arranged entirely differently. Therefore, Shabbat is simultaneously a tradition, a social pause, and a subject of dispute over freedom of movement. Myth number 10. On Shabbat, literally no one does anything. If that were true, hospitals, fire stations, security services, power plants, and water systems would have to stop.
But preserving life and critical infrastructure requires work. Even in the strictest religious logic, saving a life takes priority. The question is not total inactivity, but which activities can be postponed and how to perform what is necessary. The difference is especially noticeable in the city. A closed shop creates a feeling of stoppage, but behind the closed door, many invisible systems continue working. A medic reports for a shift. A dispatcher monitors the network. A hotel employee helps guests. A family prepared food in advance but still takes care of children and the elderly.
Therefore, the phrase, "no one does anything," confuses the absence of usual commercial activity with the absence of life. This pause has both value and a cost. For people who observe Shabbat, the common rhythm allows them to rest together without having to justify themselves to an employer. For those who do not observe and do not have a car, limited transport can complicate a trip to relatives, to work, or to a doctor. In one and the same phenomenon, there is protection of collective time and a limitation of individual choice. A grown-up account must hold both sides. Myth number 11. The Jewish New Year is just an ordinary New Year, only moved to September. Rosh Hashanah indeed usually falls in September or early October, according to the Gregorian calendar. But the Jewish calendar is not a calendar with different month names. It is lunisolar. The months are tied to the lunar cycle, and to keep holidays from drifting out of their seasons, an extra month is added in certain years. Thus, the date on the familiar calendar changes, while the seasonal meaning is preserved. The holiday itself also does not copy a night with fireworks and a countdown. In religious tradition, it is a time of judgment, remembrance, and the start of a period of self-reflection that leads to Yom Kippur. At the family table, symbolic foods appear: apples with honey as a wish for a sweet year, pomegranate, and other dishes that vary by community. The same holiday can be a profound religious event, a family gathering, or just part of the national calendar. People are often surprised by the counting of years. Traditional chronology dates it from the religiously calculated date of the creation of the world. That does not mean that every scientist or secular person rejects modern geology and cosmology. A religious calendar can be used as a cultural system of time, and a scientific one as a description of the physical history of the universe. The myth arises when one system is automatically taken as a denial of the other. Myth number 12. Yom Kippur is just another national day off. On this day, the public space changes more than a usual mark on the calendar. For observant people, a roughly 24-hour fast and a period of prayer begins. Commercial activity sharply decreases, roads empty, the usual noise disappears. In some cities, children take bicycles onto wide streets that on a normal day are filled with cars. Even many non-religious people participate in the general pause in their own way. But in public memory, Yom Kippur carries another layer. On October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria started a war precisely on this day. Therefore, the religious time of repentance became linked with the memory of a surprise attack, mobilization, losses, and failures of warning. One name, Yom Kippur War, connects the calendar and a national trauma. To call Yom Kippur an ordinary day off is to fail to see how a society can synchronously change its behavior without total physical coercion. But romanticizing the empty roads is also unwarranted. For medical workers, emergency services, and people who need help, the day does not become carefree silence. Society's pause depends on someone continuing to work. Looking at the calendar more broadly reveals another oversimplification. The phrase, "the country lives by the Jewish calendar," sounds as if there are no other calendars alongside. Muslim, Christian, and Druze communities observe their own religious dates. The work schedule of a school, municipality, or family
may depend on the population makeup of a particular city. One person follows national holidays, another simultaneously tracks Ramadan, Easter, or the holiday of their community. This is not decorative diversity.
The calendar determines when a family can gather, whether a store is open, how busy the road is, when a student takes an exam, and whether an employee can take a day off. Recognition of a holiday in law or a collective agreement turns religious identity into a practical question of equality. If the calendar of the majority is perceived as neutral time, and the calendar of the minority as a private request, formal diversity does not yet mean equal convenience. Sukkot especially shows how an ancient tradition changes the modern city. On balconies, in courtyards, near restaurants and public institutions, temporary huts appear, sukkahs. Their roof must be made of plant material and preserve a sense of temporariness. For an observant family, it is a space for eating, socializing, and remembering the wandering. For the architect of a high-rise building, it is a question of available space. For the municipality, structural safety. For a restaurant, a way to serve guests in accordance with tradition. Associated with the holiday is the etrog, a citron fruit, used together with branches of palm, myrtle, and willow. At a special market, a buyer examines the shape, surface, and preservation of the fruit's tip with the attention of a collector. A perfect specimen can cost a lot. From the outside, it is easy to mock. Why pay for a fruit that is not going to be eaten? But the price relates not to nutritional value, but to the suitability of a ritual object and the rarity of the needed qualities. The same logic applies in the market for art, collectible coins, or wedding jewelry. Society pays for meaning, not for calories. The calendar also changes the sense of the year. The Gregorian date of the holiday shifts, but within the lunisolar system it remains in its place. A person lives in several time coordinates simultaneously. International business schedules a meeting by one calendar, family life by another, and religious practice counts the start of the day from evening. Therefore, the phrase, "What's today's date?" does not always have a single cultural answer. The most interesting thing happens at the boundary between the personal and the public. A secular person may not believe in the religious meaning of the holiday, but remember the family meal and take advantage of the day off. A religious person may work in an institution that is obligated to serve everyone. An Arab doctor may be on duty during a Jewish holiday, and a Jewish colleague may cover for him during a Muslim or Christian holiday. The calendar becomes a system of mutual dependence. Therefore, time in Israel is not a single clockwork mechanism. It is several rhythms layered on top of each other. Sometimes they create a beautiful pause, sometimes a domestic conflict, sometimes an opportunity for mutual assistance. And if a tourist notices only the closed store door, he sees only the outermost layer. Myth number 13. The kibbutz is a commune where everyone still shares everything and there is no personal money. This was indeed the ideal of the early kibbutz movement: collective ownership, shared labor, joint decisions, a common budget, and strong equality in consumption. The first kibbutz, Degania, arose at the beginning of the 20th century near the Kinneret. Such settlements played a notable role in agriculture, land development, politics, and the formation of elites in the young state. But the kibbutz did not freeze in an old photograph. Economic crises, generational changes, and people's desire for greater personal autonomy led many communities to privatize income, housing, and services. In some places, a high degree of collectivity remains. In others, the difference from an ordinary small settlement has become much smaller. Some kibbutzim continue to engage in agriculture. Others develop industry, tourism, and technology. The most interesting question is not, does communism work in miniature, but what part of collective responsibility are people willing to keep when the founding generation disappears? Joint risk insurance, assistance to the elderly, children's education,
and the democratic assembly can outlive a uniform salary. The kibbutz shows that social models rarely disappear or remain intact entirely. They break down into elements, and each generation chooses anew. Myth number 14. In Israel, every citizen, without exception, undergoes the same military service. Compulsory service indeed deeply affects society and concerns many men and women, but the word everyone conceals a system of exemptions, deferments, differences by gender, health, religious status, origin, and other grounds. Terms and rules change. Some serve in combat units, others in technical, medical, or administrative roles. Some perform alternative forms of civilian service, and some do not serve at all. The uneven distribution of the burden is one of the most acute internal debates. The issue of conscripting ultra-Orthodox students of religious institutions has, for decades, been tied to government decisions, court rulings, and mass protests. Arab citizens are mostly not subject to compulsory conscription, although certain groups and individuals serve voluntarily or have their own traditions of service. Therefore, the army is not a universal machine through which the population passes in identical uniform. At the same time, the impact of service cannot be measured only by the number of months.
Acquaintances, technical skills, and trust formed in a unit can help in finding a job or starting a company. This accelerates some careers and at the same time closes doors for those who lack such experience. The system creates social capital, but distributes it unevenly. And here it is especially important not to turn compulsory service into a romantic rite of passage. For the individual, it is risk, discipline, and years of life that he or she does not always control voluntarily. For society, it is a means of defense, and at the same time, an ongoing argument about fairness. Two truths exist together. Myth number 15. Israel is a startup nation. Therefore, most residents work in technology and live very richly. The technology sector is indeed disproportionately large. The OECD reports that in 2024, Israel's spending on research and development was about 6.8% of GDP, one of the highest figures among the organization's countries.
Companies in navigation, computer vision, medical devices, cybersecurity, and agricultural technology have emerged here. International corporations have opened research centers, and venture capital has become an important part of the economy. But a high figure does not mean that 7 out of 100 people personally sit in a lab and receive an equally high salary. Spending is concentrated in individual companies and sectors. The economy includes teachers, salespeople, construction workers, medical professionals, drivers, hotel workers, social services, and many low-paid occupations. Housing and food prices affect everyone, while the incomes of the technology sector are not distributed to everyone. Even the origin of innovation is more complex than the legend of a talented loner in a garage. Behind the product stand a school, a university, a military or civilian research environment, state infrastructure, the immigration of specialists, an investor, and the global market.
The success is real, but it is institutional. The story of one genius came up with an app is convenient for a presentation and almost useless for understanding a country. There is also the price of success. When a high-paying sector competes for apartments, services, and personnel, it can push the cost of living upward for those whose salaries grow more slowly. Therefore, the tech boom and dissatisfaction with expensive housing do not contradict each other. They can be two sides of the same process. This myth can be tested with a simple mental walk. In the morning, an engineer enters a glass-fronted tower. Downstairs, a cleaner finishes their shift. A courier delivers food. A bus driver picks up passengers. A kindergarten teacher opens the daycare center. All of them participate in the functioning of one city, but the rise in rent affects them unevenly. The economy can produce expensive companies, and simultaneously make an ordinary apartment less affordable. The technology sector also influences geography. Jobs concentrate where there are universities, investors, transportation, and already established networks of specialists. A peripheral city may see national success in the news, but not receive the same density of opportunities. Government programs attempt to narrow the gap. Companies open separate sites outside the center, yet the cluster effect is difficult to transfer through an administrative decision. The immigration of specialists adds another layer. A person arrives with a diploma and experience, but their qualifications are not always automatically recognized. One quickly enters the technology field, another starts work below their previous professional level. A generation later, children may gain new opportunities, but family memory retains the cost of this transition.
Therefore, the phrase, "a nation of talent," needs to be supplemented with the question, who got the opportunity to apply their talent, and how long did recognition take? Military service, too, is not an automatic factory for entrepreneurs. Some units provide rare technical skills and a strong network of contacts. Other roles are barely connected to a future civilian profession. A person who did not serve for a legitimate reason may find themselves outside an informal circle of recommendations. What helps a system quickly find trusted people simultaneously creates a closed entry. Finally, innovation does not always mean public benefit. An app can save time, a medical device can save a life, drip irrigation can reduce water consumption, but surveillance technology can limit private life. An algorithm can amplify discrimination, and a successful company sale does not guarantee job retention. A mature attitude toward innovation does not worship novelty.
It asks who benefits, who bears the risk, and who controls the outcome. Therefore, the nickname Startup Nation can be kept if it is understood as a description of an important sector, not of the entire society. It is a door into a conversation, not a final answer. Behind the door are a school, the army, a university, an investment fund, an expensive apartment, family migration, a successful stock market exit, and a person who cannot afford to live near their workplace. We began with a kitchen and a calendar, then saw how a common rhythm turns into institutions. Now, we will step out of the city. Beyond the last house begins another Israel, the one most often shown on postcards, but also misunderstood. Myth number 16. Israel is nothing but desert. This image did not appear out of nowhere. The Negev occupies most of the country's south, and on the map its space indeed dominates. But the political border unites several climate zones. The Mediterranean coast, the hills, the northern valleys, the Kinneret region, the Jordan Rift Valley, and the far south differ in rainfall, vegetation, elevation, and population density. The word desert describes an important part of the country, but not the entire country. Even the Negev cannot be imagined as a uniform sea of sand. There are stone plateaus, dry riverbeds, mountain forms, settlements, military zones, nature reserves, agricultural plots, and industrial infrastructure. The desert landscape often appears motionless, but it is shaped by rare, powerful floods, wind, temperature swings, and very long geological time. The main mistake of the myth is the assumption that desert means uselessness. For millennia, people collected rainwater here, laid trade routes, and adapted their economy to scarcity. Modern agriculture added drip irrigation, greenhouses, brackish water management, and precise measurement. This is not a victory over nature.
Rather, it is an expensive contract with nature in which violating the terms is quickly punished. The story of drip irrigation is especially telling. The popular account links its development to the observation of engineer Simcha Blas. Next to a leaking pipe, a tree grew better, even though the soil surface remained dry. The idea of delivering a small amount of water directly to the roots became the basis of a commercial system. But the technology does not create water. It reduces losses and distributes a scarce resource more precisely. The difference is fundamental. Conservation does not equal infinity. Myth number 17. Makhtesh Ramon is a giant meteorite crater. From the edge, it indeed looks as if a celestial body struck the mountain. A huge oval depression, steep walls, layers of rock, and the desert scale make the brain search for an instantaneous catastrophe.
But the Israel Nature and Parks Authority classifies this feature as a makhtesh, an erosion form particularly characteristic of the region. The mechanism is much slower than an explosion. Layers of hard rock formed an uplifted structure above softer rocks. Cracks allowed water to penetrate inside. Erosion gradually carried away the soft material through a draining canyon, and the hard shell collapsed. This created the depression, which outwardly resembles a crater but requires neither a meteorite nor a volcano. This myth is important not only as a geology lesson. It shows how dependent we are on a dramatic explanation. An impact from space seems worthy of a grand landscape, while water and time seem too mundane. But if you imagine millions of years of work by rare streams, the slow version becomes no less grandiose. A catastrophe creates a picture in seconds. Erosion does so with patience, which the human mind is barely capable of perceiving. There is also a practical side. A geological feature is not an empty backdrop for an off-road vehicle. The fragile desert surface recovers slowly, and routes, trash, and nighttime lighting affect the ecosystem. Therefore, a protected landscape requires restrictions. The rule is familiar again. A natural wonder does not exist independently of management, but thanks to it. Myth number 18. The Dead Sea is unchanging because it has existed since antiquity. A person stands by the water, reads an ancient description, and sees a familiar landscape. It seems that empires change, but the sea remains. Yet the shoreline of the Dead Sea is retreating, and the figure for its surface elevation depends on the year of measurement. Therefore, reference books from different decades cite different values below sea level. This is not necessarily a mistake. It is a consequence of the change in the feature itself. The Dead Sea, strictly speaking, is an endorheic salt lake. Water enters the system but does not leave via a river to the ocean. It evaporates, leaving salts behind. The reduction of inflow from the Jordan River basin, water abstraction, and industrial use have intensified the drop in level. Sinkholes appear on the exposed shore. Freshwater penetrates underground salt layers, dissolves them, and the surface can suddenly collapse. These sinkholes turn geology into economics. A road has to be closed, a beach relocated, a plot declared hazardous. A hotel owner is not helped by a phrase about the eternity of a biblical landscape if the shore has receded by hundreds of meters. The map of the resort area becomes outdated literally before one's eyes. High salinity is also surrounded by myths. Yes, dense water strongly supports the body, but this does not mean that drowning is impossible. Getting water into the respiratory tract is dangerous. Turning face down can be difficult, and salt irritates the eyes and damaged skin. The tourist trick of reading a newspaper while floating on the water does not negate the need to follow safety rules. The story of the Dead Sea is not a tale about a dead place. It is a story about a living system, which human water consumption is changing faster than our perceptions of it can be updated. Myth number 19. The Kinneret is only a biblical shrine and a beautiful lake. For a Christian pilgrim, the Sea of Galilee is associated with gospel events and locations around Capernaum. For a tourist, it is a landscape and fish in a restaurant. But for the water history of modern Israel, the Kinneret was critical infrastructure. Official government materials describe the national water carrier, completed in 1964, a network of canals, pipes, pumps, and reservoirs that connected northern water sources with the center
and the arid south.
In the news, people tracked the lake's level and the red lines for years, below which water extraction created a risk to quality and the ecosystem. Centimeters of rainfall became a national news story. This shows how much the lake was not a symbol, but a measuring instrument for the state of the country. Then, the logic of the system changed. The development of seawater desalination reduced dependence on the Kinneret. The infrastructure, which once took water from the lake and directed it southward, gained the ability to work in the opposite direction and deliver desalinated water to the lake. An almost symbolic engineering gesture. The network ceased to be only a tool of extraction and became a tool of support. But here, one must not create a new myth. That technology has saved the lake forever. The Kinneret remains an ecosystem dependent on rainfall, inflows, water quality, management, and regional politics. A pipe helps, but it does not negate the climate. Myth number 20. Israel solved its drinking water problem once and for all. Desalination of seawater has become one of the country's largest infrastructure achievements. Large reverse osmosis plants operate on the coast. Official government projects speak of further capacity growth, and the map of the national water system shows how complex the network has become. Seawater and brackish water plants, reservoirs, pumping stations, pipelines for drinking and treated water. But the word solved is too final. The State Controller of Israel, in a 2024 audit, noted not only the contribution of 5 major plants, but also problems with oversight, reporting, pollution of source seawater, and long-term planning. In 2022, these plants supplied approximately 1/3 of all delivered fresh water, according to the report's methodology. At the same time, forecasts expected demand to grow and natural resource availability to decline by mid-century. Reverse osmosis requires energy and maintenance. Membranes need protection, water needs testing, and concentrated brine must be returned to the sea in compliance with environmental standards. The Ministry of Environmental Protection directly views desalination as a national necessity, but accompanies it with requirements for the marine and coastal environment. The Ministry of Health maintains a drinking water quality monitoring database, including major treatment and desalination facilities. That is, success does not lie in the risk having disappeared. Success lies in creating a system capable of producing, blending, delivering, and testing water. And maturity begins with acknowledging this system's vulnerability. A single accident, pollution at the intake, a power outage, or delayed capacity expansion can bring back anxiety. Finally, drinking water is only part of the water balance. Agriculture, industry, and nature also require the resource. If a city gets its water from the sea, it does not mean that rivers, lakes, and groundwater aquifers no longer matter. Technology changes the distribution of scarcity, but does not eliminate the fundamental limitation of water in an arid region. Myth number 21. Draining swamps always means progress. Fewer diseases, more land. In the mid-20th century, the Hula Valley swamps were seen as a source of malaria and an area that could be turned into agricultural fields. Draining looked like rational modernization. But after the intervention, the peat soils began to erode, fires and dust events occurred, and nutrients entered the Kinneret water system. Part of the bird and other species' habitat disappeared. Later, part of the area was re-wetted and restored as a natural and tourist site. The mistake could not simply be undone by pressing a reverse button. The restored system is not identical to the former swamp, and managing water and soil requires ongoing work. But acknowledging the consequences changed the approach. This story is important precisely because the initial decision was not insane. It was made within the framework of the knowledge, sanitary fears, and economic goals of its time. This is how dangerous errors are born.
not necessarily from ill intent, but from the certainty that a complex ecosystem has one function and one flaw. Today, the valley lies on one of the major bird migration routes between Eurasia and Africa. Huge flows of birds pass over the region, using the land and rising air currents. Some birds stop to rest and feed. Thus, the former useless swamp turned out to be an element of a continental-scale system. Myth number 22. A small country cannot be a global natural crossroads. The size of the territory is deceptive once again. Israel is located between the Mediterranean Sea, desert expanses, and the land bridge connecting Africa and Eurasia.
For large soaring birds, the sea and desert create costly segments of the route, and the narrow strip of land becomes a beneficial corridor. Therefore, in spring and autumn, the sky can tell you more about geography than a political map. But the migration corridor is not just a beautiful spectacle. Birds face power lines, glass buildings, poisoning, loss of stopover sites, and the risk of collision with aircraft. Nature conservation here intersects with agriculture, aviation, and urban development. To preserve the route, it is not enough to declare a single park. One must see the chain of places where a bird feeds, rests, and gains altitude. This logic changes the usual view of borders. For humans, a border is a legal line and a control system. For a bird, it does not exist. But lighting, water, landing fields, and hazardous structures exist on both sides. Ecology forces cooperation even where politics builds division. The same lesson is visible in the far south, in the Gulf of Eilat. In a tourist photo, the coral reef looks like a separate world under clear water. Fish, corals, divers, and sun glints. A myth arises that the reef is protected by its beauty and remoteness alone. But the coral system is sensitive to temperature, pollution, construction, shipping, and visitor behavior. One careless anchor or constant load in a shallow area can damage a structure that grew very slowly. The Eilat Reef also attracts scientific attention because some local corals demonstrate relatively high resistance to heat. In an era of climate change, this sounds like good news. But resistance is not invulnerability. If the water heats up while pollution, physical destruction, and other stresses increase, even a resilient system can cross a threshold. Scientific interest does not replace protection. Thus, another dangerous formula emerges. Nature will adapt. Adaptation occurs within a certain range and requires time. Temperature can change faster than a population can manage to adapt. A species may survive, but a complex web of relationships may disappear. The reef will remain on the map, but its biological content will become poorer. Water connects Eilat with the Dead Sea and the Kinneret, although these systems are very different. Projects to transfer water between basins regularly promise to solve several tasks at once: provide drinking water, support falling water levels, generate energy, or strengthen cooperation. But a large pipe carries not only water, it carries chemical differences, ecological risk, cost, and political dependence. Therefore, a project that looks beautiful as an arrow on a map can remain a subject of calculations and disputes for decades. The Dead Sea especially clearly shows the regional nature of the problem. Its basin is not subject to a single administration, and the Jordan River and related water resources affect several societies. It is impossible to sustainably manage a lake if each participant sees only their own stretch of shore. Water forces discussion of what politics prefers to divide. And here it is worth returning to the desalination figures. The official project for the plant in Western Galilee indicated that after capacity expansion, desalinated water production should cover a very large share of domestic and industrial freshwater consumption. This is an impressive goal, but the wording does not mean that 9 out of 10 glasses in every home come directly from the sea.
In a unified network, water mixes, sources change by season and region, and the figure compares production volume with a specific category of demand. In a documentary text, such distinctions are critical. 90% of consumption easily turns into 90% of the country's entire water, then into all water comes from the sea. At each step, the phrase becomes more striking and less accurate. Therefore, a source must not only be named, but also its unit of measurement read. There is also invisible water, the water embedded in food and goods. Importing grain or feed effectively transfers into the country the water spent on their production elsewhere. Exporting agricultural products, on the contrary, is tied to the local water footprint, although technology may use the resource very efficiently. A discussion of water independence without trade is always incomplete. Finally, water is a question of fairness. The average volume at the national level does not indicate whether all populated localities are supplied equally reliably, whether infrastructure and quality control are accessible to different communities, who pays for connection, and who first faces restrictions. A technological solution becomes a public one only when it reaches the tap of a specific person. Therefore, the central paradox of Israel's water story sounds like this. The country really reduced its dependence on random rainfall, but it became more dependent on complex technology, energy, the sea, the network, and the quality of management. Vulnerability did not disappear. It changed form. Instead of one cloud, now thousands of details must be controlled. This is not a defeat of technology. It is its real cost. We have passed through deserts, lakes, pipes, and swamps. Now we can go deeper, beneath the modern surface. There lies another set of myths, that archaeology provides simple answers. Ancient texts are read literally, and stones themselves can decide who owns the present. Myth number 23. Armageddon is a real mountain where the end of the world will inevitably occur. The word has entered mass culture so deeply that it has almost separated from geography.
It is used to mean nuclear war, an asteroid, climate catastrophe, and any film where humanity has 2 hours left. The origin of the name is linked to Megiddo, an ancient settlement located at a strategic pass above the Jericho Valley. In Greek transmission, the expression Har Megiddo, the mountain of Megiddo, became a sign of the final battle in the book of Revelation. But before the traveler lies not a high mountain, but a tell, an artificially grown hill made of layers of settlements. People built a city, destroyed or abandoned it, then new generations erected buildings on top of the previous ones. Over millennia, rubble, walls, and earth created an elevation. UNESCO includes Megiddo together with Hazor and Beersheba in the World Heritage Site Biblical Tells, and emphasizes their multi-layered structure, water systems, and connection to trade routes. The strategic location helps to understand why the place found itself in the language of the final battle. Armies and merchants moved through the pass, and control over the road meant power over exchange between Egypt, the coast, and the northern regions. The apocalyptic symbol grew not from random fantasy, but from the memory of a place where clashes truly repeated. But archaeology does not assign a date for the end of the world. It shows cities, gates, storehouses, stables, temples, water systems, and traces of destruction, and the interpretation of each layer remains a subject of scholarly work. Megiddo is more interesting as an archive of many human worlds than as a backdrop for a single future event. Myth number 24. Jericho is an Israeli city that archaeology unequivocally confirms in every detail of the biblical account. Here we need to stop even before the excavations. Ancient Jericho, Tel es Sultan, is located in the West Bank in Palestine.
UNESCO has inscribed it on the World Heritage List as a property of the State of Palestine.
This alone shows why one cannot mechanically include every well-known site of the region in the list of Israel's attractions, as if modern political geography did not exist. The archaeological significance of the site is enormous. UNESCO describes traces of human activity reaching back to approximately 10,500 BCE, the transition to sedentary life, early fortifications, and a multi-layered history. It is one of the key monuments of Neolithization and early urban culture in the Levant. But the question of a specific correlation between destroyed layers and the biblical narrative has provoked scholarly debate for decades. The popular version wants a simple shot. The ancient wall fell, therefore the text is fully confirmed. Science asks more complex questions. Which layer is before us? What is its dating? What happened to the settlement in that period? How reliable the chronology is? And what exactly the literary source asserts?
The difference between "the city existed" and "every detail of the story is proven" is enormous. And even more important is the water source. The longevity of the settlement is explained not only by walls, but also by a permanent spring. Empires succeeded one another, but water allowed people to live again and again in the same place. The strongest story of Jericho may turn out to be not the story of the wall's destruction, but the story of why, after every destruction, people returned. Myth number 25. Hezekiah's tunnel proves that ancient builders possessed unknown technologies. Under Jerusalem runs an ancient water tunnel that connected the Gihon Spring to a pool inside the fortified city. Its length exceeds 500 meters. The route curves and the elevation difference is surprisingly small. Two groups worked toward each other and met inside the rock. For a modern visitor walking through the water with a flashlight, this indeed looks almost impossible. But the word unknown is often used as a bridge to pseudo-history. If we do not know every detail of the method, that does not mean lasers, aliens, or a lost supercivilization. The workers could orient themselves by geology, cracks, sound, surface markers, and adjust the direction as they advanced. Errors and turns in the route actually show human searching, not a perfect machine. The Siloam inscription, discovered in the 19th century, is of particular value. It describes the moment when the two groups approached each other and the water flowing through the channel. Today, the inscription is kept in Istanbul because it was taken out during the Ottoman Empire, and the question of its return is periodically raised in diplomacy. Thus, one engineering structure links ancient defense, the labor of stonecutters, archaeology, and a modern dispute over cultural heritage. The main conclusion is simple. Ancient people do not need fantastic help to impress us. They had observation, organization, time, skill, and a very strong reason to preserve water during the threat of siege. Myth number 26. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found by chance, and from that moment scholars immediately gained free access to them. The story of the discovery indeed begins almost like an adventure film. In the late 1940s, Bedouins discovered manuscripts in caves near Qumran. Then, other caves appeared, along with an enormous number of fragments. The texts were written mainly in Hebrew and Aramaic, and partly in Greek. They included biblical manuscripts and documents of the community that lived in the region during the Second Temple period. But the word "found" creates the impression of a single moment and a single owner. The fragments passed through the hands of local residents, dealers, scholars, and state institutions. The political situation changed, territories came under different control, and the antiquities market complicated the documentation of provenance. Some materials may have been lost or separated from their original context. Access also did not become instantly open. The publication of some fragments stretched over decades, and a narrow circle of researchers controlled the materials longer than many colleagues considered acceptable. Later, digital projects made images much more accessible. The scientific revolution occurred not only thanks to the discovery of manuscripts, but also thanks to the expansion of access to them. What did they prove? They provided significantly earlier versions of texts and allowed comparison of how manuscripts were transmitted and differed. But the phrase, "the text has not changed a single letter," is too strong. There are variants, orthographic differences, and different textual traditions.
The significance of the find is not in absolute immutability, but in the opportunity to see the real history of textual transmission. Myth number 27. The Western Wall is the surviving wall of the Second Temple itself. The Western Wall, often called the Wailing Wall, is part of the retaining system of the vast Temple Mount platform, expanded under Herod the Great. It was not a wall of the inner temple building. The difference seems technical, but it helps to understand the scale of the engineering project. The builders held an artificially enlarged platform on difficult terrain. The visible prayer section is only a part of a much longer wall. Other fragments are hidden by urban development and accessible in tunnels. The masonry contains stones from different eras, and the enormous blocks from Herodian times raise an understandable question about transportation and placement.
But as with the tunnel, the absence of a complete construction log does not justify attributing the work to supernatural technology. For a believer, the significance of the place is not limited to its architectural function. Proximity to the Temple Mount, centuries of prayer, and the memory of the destroyed temple have created a religious center. Notes in the cracks, separated prayer zones, and rules of conduct belong to a living tradition, not a museum reconstruction. And here, archaeology, faith, and politics are literally adjacent. Any excavations, passages, and construction work can be perceived through the lens of access to holy sites and the status of the territory. Therefore, the phrase, "it's just a retaining wall," is just as incorrect as the phrase, "it's the wall of the temple itself." Architectural accuracy does not negate accumulated significance. Myth number 28. The history of Masada is fully known and literally confirms the account of the deaths of 960 defenders.
UNESCO describes Masada as a palace complex of Herod the Great, a natural fortress above the Dead Sea, and a site of outstanding Roman siege works. From the summit, one can see the camps, the circumvallation wall, and the assault ramp. The water collection system made it possible to sustain life in conditions that seem incompatible with a luxurious palace. The main literary account of the siege's finale was left by Josephus. According to his version, the defenders preferred death to captivity. This story became a powerful symbol and entered the national memory. But a single written source, created by someone who was not a direct eyewitness to the final night, requires caution. Archaeology confirms the siege, the Roman presence, and many details of the site, but it cannot authenticate every episode of the speech and the exact number of dead. Modern scholars debate the composition of the defenders, the details of the finale, and how later society turned Masada into a heroic myth. Doubt here does not demean the monument. On the contrary, it separates what can be seen in stone from what is known through literary narrative. The contrast is especially telling. For a Roman engineer, Masada was a logistical and siege problem. For Herod, a refuge and palace. For a rebel, the last stronghold. For a modern tourist, a cable car and a sunrise. One object changes meaning depending on who is looking at it. Myth number 29. Acre is just an ordinary Ottoman old city, and Caesarea is just Roman ruins by the sea. These two places are conveniently combined because they shatter opposite mistakes. In Acre, the visible Ottoman fabric conceals a large layer of the medieval Crusader city.
UNESCO notes that the remains of the Crusader city survive beneath the later fortified construction and provide a rare picture of a medieval capital and port. The city did not replace one history with another. It literally built one on top of the other.
Caesarea, by contrast, looks like an open stage by the sea. Theater, hippodrome, remains of the harbor, aqueduct. Herod the Great created a large artificial harbor where there was no natural sheltered anchorage. For construction, they used hydraulic concrete capable of hardening underwater. This was not a copy of a natural harbor, but an attempt to change the economic geography of the coast through engineering. In Caesarea, an inscription with the name of Pontius Pilate was discovered, an important material confirmation of his office in Judea. But even such a find confirms a specific person and title, not automatically every scene of later narrative. Archaeological modesty is again more important than sensationalism. Acre and Caesarea show two ways of preserving the past. One was buried and thereby survived. The sea, time, and the reuse of materials partially destroyed others, but the large structures remained visible. Ruins are not a single category. Sometimes emptiness speaks of destruction, sometimes of stones being taken apart for a new city, and sometimes an entire street continues to exist under a modern house. Between the ancient ports and the modern state lies another myth, which often hides within stories about the year 1948, that the state emerged in a single short ceremony. On the 14th of May, 1948, David Ben-Gurion did read the Declaration of Independence in Tel Aviv. The official text was published by the Knesset. It proclaimed the creation of the state and contained promises of freedom, justice, equality, and protection of holy places. But no state is created merely by reading a document. Before the ceremony, there existed political organizations, institutions of the Jewish Yeshuv, waves of immigration, conflict with the Arab population, the British Mandate, international decisions, and civil war. After the ceremony came the invasion of neighboring armies, war, mass displacement of people, formation of state institutions, and long-term consequences for Palestinians and the entire region. The short ceremony is important precisely as a legal and symbolic threshold. Before it, the political future formally remained one thing. After it, a proclaimed state appeared. But the threshold does not explain the road to it, nor does it convey what all people on both sides experienced. For some, it is a day of independence. For others, a memory of the Nakba, catastrophe, expulsion, and loss of home. These memories do not become the same just because a historian accurately names the date. There is a temptation to resolve the memory conflict by choosing one version, either birth or catastrophe. But public reality is not obliged to obey the rule by which recognition of another's loss cancels one's own history. A documentary narrative can hold two perspectives, without mixing facts and without requiring the viewer to pretend that no contradiction exists. It is useful to read the Declaration not only as a monument, but as a promise, which can be compared with subsequent practice. This is a normal way to work with the founding document of any country. If the text promises equality, the researcher asks how the principle is reflected in laws, institutions, and everyday life. The gap between ideal and practice does not make the document meaningless. It turns it into a criterion for evaluation. The very location of the ceremony also destroys the myth of a prearranged, grandiose spectacle. The decision was made under conditions of war and risk. The space was chosen with security in mind. Invitations were sent hastily. At that moment, the history of the state looks not like an inevitable finale, but like the action of people who did not know the future outcome. In hindsight, we see the flag, signatures, and a completed chronology. The participants saw the uncertainty of the next day. And this is a good principle for the entire historical part. People of the past did not know how their present would end. The inhabitants of Megiddo did not build a tell for the future book of Revelation. The stonecutters did not dig a tunnel so that thousands of years later, tourists would walk through it with flashlights. The residents of Acre did not bury the city for archaeological preservation. When we restore uncertainty to the past, it ceases to be a backdrop for our conclusions. There is another important boundary. Historical connection does not equal automatic modern right to any action. An archaeologist can confirm the presence of a community, date a building, and describe destruction. The legal question requires laws, treaties, court decisions, and international norms. The religious question requires the language of faith. The political question requires discussion of power and interests. An attempt to make one type of evidence do the work of all the others creates not truth, but propaganda. That is why we do not use antiquity as a competition of who was first. In the region, almost any answer depends on the chosen point of reference. Before the modern nation, there were other political forms. Before them, empires and cities. Before cities, settlements. Being first in one layer does not erase the people of the subsequent layer. Archaeology is valuable because it expands memory, not because it reduces it to a victor. Myth number 30. Jerusalem can be understood by choosing one correct story. We have come to the last myth, not because it is the most striking, but because all the previous ones converge in it. Language, calendar, food, water, archaeology, law, faith, tourism, memory, and security. Everything ends up inside a small space. The old city can be walked on foot, but it cannot be quickly explained. UNESCO describes it as a holy city for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and lists hundreds of historical monuments. Within the old walls are the Temple Mount, or Haram al-Sharif, with the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Western Wall, quarters and shrines of various communities. Physical proximity does not create automatic agreement. On the contrary, it makes every question of access, excavation, of security, and a symbolic gesture especially sensitive. Also important is how UNESCO formulates its legal disclaimer. The inscription of a heritage property, maps, and names does not imply the organization's position on the legal status of any territory, city, or borders. This phrase may seem bureaucratic, but it protects accuracy. The cultural significance of a place and its international legal status are not the same question. Jerusalem is often shown from above. Stones, walls, golden-hued stone. From a height, people disappear, and the conflict seems like a dispute of symbols. But the city exists below. A child walks to school, a merchant opens his shop, a clergyman prepares for service, a police officer checks a passage, a family drives to the hospital, a tourist looks for the right gate. A political decision changes not only a line on the map, but also the travel time of a specific person. Even the Christian Via Dolorosa route is not a fixed line, invariably known since the 1st century. The tradition of the route and the number of stations have formed over time, and the last stations are inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Within the church itself, different Christian denominations share rights and obligations, and order is maintained by complex historical agreements. The famous immovable ladder on the facade has become a symbol of how difficult it can be to change even a minor detail when it touches the balance of communities. The old walls are also younger than many of the stories inside them. The fortifications visible today mostly date from the Ottoman period. Modern urban construction uses light stone, creating visual unity, but a uniform color does not mean a uniform memory. One person sees in the stone a connection to ancestors, another a shrine of their faith, a third a home, a fourth proof of loss, a fifth an object of study. Therefore, this film cannot be concluded with the phrase, This is the real Jerusalem. There are many real experiences of the city, and they are not always compatible. But this does not mean that truth is impossible and that anything can be said. Dates, documents, architectural functions, and archaeological layers are verifiable. One cannot call a retaining wall a temple building wall. One cannot confuse a heritage object with a decision on sovereignty. One cannot present one religious tradition as the consensus of all historians. Accuracy remains possible even without simplicity. Before the finale, let us conduct one last check, not of the country, but of our own method. Imagine 3 phrases. First, Israel gets almost all its water from the sea. Second, the Dead Sea will soon disappear. Third, archaeologists have proven a biblical story. Each sounds convincing because it connects a real topic with an absolute conclusion. For the first phrase, one must open a document on the water system and see what exactly is being measured. It could refer to the design capacity of desalination plants relative to domestic and industrial demand, to actual production in a given year, or to the share of all fresh water, including agriculture. These are different indicators. One must then account for the mixing of sources in the national network. After verification, the sensation becomes a precise but still impressive statement. Desalination provides a huge portion of certain categories of demand and has radically changed the water balance. For the second phrase, a timescale is needed. The Dead Sea level is falling. The shoreline is receding. Sinkholes are destroying infrastructure. This is an observed crisis. But the word soon requires a model and a date, and the word disappear requires a definition. Will the northern basin remain? Will the rate change? Will support projects be implemented? How will industrial management affect it? An honest version does not soothe, but neither does it prescribe an apocalypse without calculation. For the third phrase, one must separate the existence of a site, the dating of a layer, the content of the text, and a specific event. Archaeology can confirm that a city was inhabited, destroyed in a certain period, or had a specified water system. It can find the name of a historical figure on an inscription. But the literary narrative includes speeches, motives, numbers, and theological meaning, which a material find is not always able to verify. The word proven must have an object. Proven what, exactly? This is how myth works in the 21st century. It rarely requires a completely fabricated fact. It is enough to remove a unit of measurement, a date, a territorial qualifier, or the phrase, according to estimates. Then the claim begins to travel. One video links to another, an article links to a video, and a search engine sees dozens of repetitions and takes them for independent confirmation. Therefore, the number of references does not equal the quality of verification. If 10 websites retell one press release figure, we still have only one source. If an official agency reports on its own program, it confirms the existence of the program well, but may not be the best independent evaluator of its success. If a state controller identifies shortcomings, that does not prove the failure of the entire system, but shows where the official story requires supplementation. For archaeology, an excavation report is useful. For the population, a statistical service. For the international status of a site, the relevant documents and decisions. For personal experience, a person's testimony. An interview with a resident does not replace a census, but a census does not explain what the resident feels. Sources do not line up on a single ladder from bad to good. Each answers its own question. There is also a moral test. When it comes to conflict, the figure of those killed, displaced, or affected is not a decorative tool to heighten drama. The date, source, and scope of the count must be stated.
Human pain cannot be turned into a backdrop for a myth about national character. No conclusion about millions of people can be drawn from a single crime, a politician's statement, or one viral video.
Precise speech sometimes sounds less impressive. As of such and such a year, within this category, researchers disagree. The source does not allow determination. These phrases slow down the narrative, but it is precisely they that distinguish an investigation from a confident retelling. The viewer does not lose emotion. They gain the ability to understand where solid ground lies and where interpretation begins. And if our episode must be longer than a short compilation of facts, length has meaning only when it makes room for these distinctions. Extra minutes are needed not to repeat one conclusion in other words, but to show the mechanism, the cost, and the limits of knowledge. Otherwise, 90 minutes turn into 30 myths stretched out by pauses. Our task is the opposite, to ensure that each new block complicates the previous one. Let us now imagine a single day in which all these layers meet without an edit cut.
In the morning, a person wakes up on Sunday and goes to work, while their European colleague rests. At home, they spoke to their parents in Russian, answered their child in Hebrew, and on the way heard Arabic speech. For breakfast, they had shakshuka, a recipe that came from North Africa, and checked whether the product had the required certification. Even in this ordinary morning, there is not a single pure, isolated tradition. The bus travels through a city faced with light stone. On their phone runs navigation created by a tech company, and outside the window is a person for whom the price of that same ride is more important than the story of a billion-dollar deal. The route depends on the calendar. Tomorrow the path may differ due to a holiday, and on Shabbat disappear entirely. For one passenger, this is part of a common rhythm. For another, a restriction on mobility. In the tap, water from different sources is mixed.
Some may have come from desalination of the sea, some from another zone of the national grid. Behind the easy turn of the handle are pumps, membranes, laboratories, energy, and regulatory decisions. A person does not think about this every morning. That is precisely what successful infrastructure looks like. But the invisibility of success must not turn into a myth about its being free. During the day, birds pass over the road, unaware of the name of the state. Their route depends on warm air, water, and preserved resting places. A few hours' drive away, a desert stream continues to slowly change the rock of Makhtesh Ramon, and the level of the Dead Sea records the consequences of decisions made far from its shore. Geography does not wait for society to finish its political dispute. In the evening, a person enters the old city. Beneath their feet may be walls from another era. A pilgrim passes nearby. An archaeologist debates the dating. A police officer keeps order. A merchant closes their shop. Each sees the place in the present, but no single gaze encompasses the entire place. If the camera chooses only the dome, the viewer gets a sanctuary. If only the confrontation, a conflict. If only the souvenir, tourism. The full scene requires holding them together. This is what a country looks like without a mythological filter. Not a chaos of facts, but a network of dependencies. Language is tied to migration, food to trade, the calendar to transport, the army to the labor market, technology to the cost of housing, desalination to energy, archaeology to the politics of memory. Tearing the network into 30 flashy cards is easy. Reassembling it, that is the work of a long documentary film. This is precisely why a different order of myths changes not just the editing. If you start with war, everything that follows will appear as its consequence. If you start with antiquity, the modern person risks becoming an extra among the ruins. We started with breakfast and language to first restore everyday life to the country. Then we showed the institutions on which this everyday life depends. and only after that did we arrive at stones and sanctuaries. Such a route does not make the conflict less important. It does not allow the conflict to consume everything else. Now, let us return to the question we started with. Why does Israel so easily turn into a myth? Because too many meanings are concentrated here in a small space. Each observer chooses the layer that confirms their expectations. The tourist chooses antiquity. The investor, technology. The pilgrim, the sanctuary. The military analyst, security. The ecologist, water. A politician, a border. The mistake begins when the chosen layer is declared to be the entire country.
We saw that Israelis are not one type of person, and that common Hebrew does not abolish multilingualism. We learned that a language is revived by society, not by a single wizard. We examined the kitchen as a history of migrations, not a patent on hummus. We saw how the religious calendar changes transportation and the work week, but does not force everyone to live the same way. We separated the real role of the army and technology from the myths about universal service and universal wealth. Then the map changed. The desert ceased to be an emptiness. Makhtesh Ramon, a meteorite crater. The Dead Sea, an eternal, motionless backdrop. The Kinneret turned out to be part of the water infrastructure, and desalination, not a miracle without a cost, but a complex system with energy, oversight, and environmental risks. The story of the Hula Valley showed that progress can first destroy and then expensively repair. Finally, the stones stopped giving convenient political answers. Megiddo turned out to be a multi-layered city, not a stage with an appointed date for the end of the world. Jericho demanded that Palestinian geography and a scientific dispute be named. Hezekiah's tunnel gave a voice back to the workers. The Dead Sea Scrolls reminded that a discovery without access remains half-closed. The Western Wall, Masada, Acre, and Caesarea showed the difference between a material fact and a later meaning. The main conclusion is not that all popular claims are false. On the contrary, most myths survive because they contain a truthful detail. The country does have a desert. Hebrew indeed underwent a rare transformation into a mass-spoken language. Military service strongly influences society. The tech sector is outstanding. Jerusalem indeed has exceptional significance for 3 religions. But a detail becomes a myth the moment it pushes out everything else. Therefore, the best question after any bold statement is not true or false, but more precisely, what part is true? What is omitted? What year do the figures refer to? Who measured it? And for whom does the experience look different? Such a question does not destroy interest. It makes interest more mature. If after this episode Israel seems to you not more understandable but more complex, that is a good result. A real country should resist a single sentence. Support the episode with a like. Write in the comments which of these myths you have heard most often and what topic should be fact-checked next. Subscribe and turn on notifications. And most importantly, do not swap one ready-made stereotype for another. Check the map, the date, the source, and who is left out of the frame.